The Assyrian Empire, stretching across Mesopotamia from the early 2nd millennium BCE until its peak in the 7th century BCE, was one of the most powerful and feared states of the ancient world. But its power did not rest on diplomacy or mercy. It rested on terror. The Assyrians understood something that many empires after them would also exploit. Fear is the strongest weapon. A spear can kill a soldier, but terror can conquer a city without a single blow. By cultivating a reputation for cruelty, the Assyrians ensured that rebellions were rare, resistance was weak, and submission was swift. Their punishments were not simply acts of justice. They were theater, carefully staged spectacles meant to intimidate entire populations. In the chronicles carved into stone reliefs and in the records of terrified enemies, we find a civilization that turned cruelty into policy, punishment into propaganda. Today, we will step into that world, a world of flaying, impalement, mutilation, and public terror, and ask ourselves, could anyone have survived under the brutal justice of the Assyrian Empire? The philosophy of fear, why the Assyrians ruled with cruelty. To understand Assyrian punishments, we must first understand why they were so extreme. After all, the Assyrians were not unique in using violence. Every ancient empire punished crime and rebellion. But the Assyrians elevated brutality into an ideological foundation of statecraft. Assyria was a landlocked state in northern Mesopotamia, surrounded by rivals, Babylonians to the south, Arameans and Hittites to the west, Elamites and Persians to the east. Unlike Egypt, which had deserts and seas for protection, Assyria was always vulnerable. Survival meant war. In this environment, the Assyrians developed a military machine that prized discipline, obedience, and ruthlessness. Every city they captured, every enemy they punished, was a warning to the next: submit or face annihilation. The Assyrian king was not just a ruler, but the chosen warrior of Ashur, the empire's chief deity. His role was to expand the borders of the empire and enforce divine order. In this worldview, cruelty was not excessive. It was sacred. Crushing rebels, punishing traitors, and terrifying enemies was framed as the will of the gods themselves. Thus, punishment was never just about justice, it was about cosmic order. To defy the king was to defy Ashur, and punishment had to reflect that blasphemy. Assyrian kings boasted of their cruelty in inscriptions and palace reliefs. Walls of royal palaces at Nineveh and Nimrud were decorated with scenes of flaying, impalement, and mutilation, not hidden away, but displayed proudly like trophies. A king might inscribe, "I cut off their heads, I stacked them in heaps. I flayed the chiefs who defied me, I hung their skins on the walls of the city." Such proclamations were not exaggerations, but deliberate propaganda. By publicizing punishments, the Assyrians ensured their reputation spread far beyond the battlefield. A city hearing of these horrors might surrender immediately rather than risk resistance. But Assyrian brutality was not reserved only for foreign enemies. Within the empire itself, fear was used to maintain order. Criminals, rebels, or even corrupt officials could be subjected to punishments so shocking that their memory lingered for generations. The philosophy was simple: mercy breeds rebellion, cruelty breeds obedience. This philosophy of fear explains why the Assyrians are remembered not just as conquerors, but as one of the most feared empires in history. Their punishments were not random acts of savagery, but carefully constructed tools of governance. For them, the greater the spectacle, the greater the stability. And so, when we read of Assyrian punishments, we must not imagine isolated cases, but a system in which every act of cruelty reinforced the empire's iron grip on its subjects. Flaying alive, the skin as a canvas of terror. Of all the punishments associated with the Assyrian Empire, none is remembered with more horror than flaying alive, the act of peeling the skin from a living person. It was not just torture, it was a spectacle, a performance of cruelty, that turned human flesh into both a warning and a canvas of imperial power. Flaying involved carefully cutting into the skin of a prisoner and then slowly stripping it away, often starting at the limbs or torso. The victim might die quickly from shock, blood loss, or infection, but in some cases, the process was drawn out to maximize suffering. Unlike beheading or impalement, which killed swiftly, flaying was designed to prolong agony and to display the torment. The skin, once removed, was not discarded. It became part of the punishment's legacy. The Assyrians perfected this grisly punishment. Inscriptions and palace reliefs boast of it openly. Kings described how they flayed rebels, enemy leaders, and those who resisted tribute. One inscription of King Ashurnasirpal II, 9th century BCE, reads, "I flayed many right through my land and draped their skins over the walls of the city." Another king, Esarhaddon, proudly claimed to have hung the flayed skins of rebels on city gates, turning them into grotesque banners of submission. The message was simple: defy Assyria, and your very body would be torn apart and displayed for all to see. The act of flaying was not the end. It was only the beginning. Sometimes, the skins of multiple rebels were draped side by side, like a ghastly tapestry. Imagine walking through your city and seeing the skin of your neighbor stretched across the gate, his face still recognizable. The sight alone was enough to break spirits. Flaying was more than punishment. It was a ritual of domination. By stripping a rebel's skin and hanging it on the city he had tried to defend, the Assyrians turned his body into a symbol of failure. His flesh became part of the empire's architecture, a permanent reminder of what happened to those who defied the king. To the Assyrians, this was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was political theatre. A single flayed body could terrify thousands into submission without another arrow being fired. The power of flaying lay not only in the act itself, but in its reputation. Few would ever witness it firsthand, but many heard of it. Rumors spread faster than armies. A city considering rebellion would think twice, knowing that if they resisted, their leaders might be skinned alive and their remains displayed in front of their children. It was a punishment designed as much for the mind as for the flesh. Who faced flaying? It was not ordinary thieves or petty criminals. Flaying was reserved for the most serious offenders, such as enemy kings or generals captured in battle, rebels who defied Assyrian authority, traitors within the empire. By targeting leaders, the Assyrians maximized the punishment's impact. When a king was flayed alive, his entire people were forced to watch the destruction of their symbol and protector. Other civilizations used flaying, the Aztecs, for example, and later medieval rulers in Europe, but the Assyrians made it central to their identity. Where others hid such brutality, the Assyrians carved it into stone reliefs in their palaces. They wanted the world to know. In this way, Assyria differs from Rome or Greece, which preferred to portray themselves as civilized. The Assyrians did not seek to appear merciful. They glorified their terror. The memory of Assyrian flaying lasted far beyond the empire itself. Babylonian and later Greek writers described the Assyrians as merciless tyrants, defined by their cruelty. Even in the Bible, the Assyrians appear as instruments of divine wrath, remembered for their brutality, and at the center of that image is the practice of flaying alive, the punishment that turned the body into a canvas of terror, the ultimate symbol of Assyrian domination. Impalement, forests of the dead. If flaying was the punishment that scarred the body and hung it on city walls, impalement was the one that scarred the land itself. When the Assyrians conquered a rebellious city, they did not simply execute its defenders. They planted them in the ground, turning their broken bodies into gruesome monuments of empire. Impalement involved forcing a sharpened stake or pole through the body, often through the torso, buttocks, or chest, and then erecting the victim upright, leaving them to die slowly in the open air. Unlike beheading, which was swift, impalement was designed for endurance. Victims could suffer for hours, sometimes days, before succumbing to blood loss, shock, or exposure. The visual effect was staggering. A single impaled body was horrifying. Dozens or hundreds raised in rows outside a city created a forest of the dead. The Assyrians used impalement systematically. Inscriptions proudly recorded, "I impaled alive on stakes the nobles, the governors, the elders of the city who had revolted, and displayed them around their city." By targeting not only warriors but also leaders and elders, the Assyrians ensured the entire community was traumatized. Anyone approaching the city saw its dignitaries writhing on poles, their deaths drawn out as a living warning. Imagine approaching a rebellious city after Assyrian conquest. Instead of sturdy gates, the first thing you see are dozens of tall wooden stakes, each bearing the body of a man or woman. Some scream in agony, others hang lifeless, their corpses already picked by birds. These forests served as boundary markers. This land now belongs to Assyria. They were psychological weapons, making resistance seem futile. Impalement was effective for several reasons. First, it was impossible to ignore. Corpses on stakes dominated the landscape. Second, unlike executions that ended quickly, impaled victims suffered visibly, their cries carrying across fields. Third, by turning humans into grotesque scarecrows, the Assyrians stripped them of dignity, reducing leaders into warnings. Lastly, rumors of impalement spread across neighboring cities, discouraging rebellion before it began. The Assyrians often staged impalements at symbolic sites, in front of city gates, so every entry and exit passed through terror. Along roads, ensuring travelers carried stories of Assyrian wrath to distant lands, around palace walls, making royal authority inseparable from fear. In some cases, bodies were left to rot for weeks, the stench itself a weapon of intimidation. Impalement was not unique to the Assyrians. Centuries later, the Persians, and even Vlad the Impaler of Wallachia, Dracula's inspiration, would use it with similar goals. But the Assyrians were among the first to adopt it systematically, weaving it into the very identity of their empire. Where others hid such cruelty, the Assyrians carved images of impalement into palace walls, showing their kings personally overseeing the process. To die by impalement was not just painful, it was humiliating. In Mesopotamian culture, proper burial was sacred. Without it, the soul wandered restless in the underworld. By impaling rebels and leaving their bodies to rot, the Assyrians denied them rest in both life and death. Thus, impalement killed the body, dishonored the memory, and condemned the soul. Like flaying, impalement became synonymous with Assyrian cruelty. Later, civilizations remembered them not as wise rulers, but as tyrants whose empire was built on human stakes. Even the Bible's portrayal of Nineveh, the bloody city, echoes this reputation. Centuries later, when impalement was revived by rulers in other lands, its association with Assyria still lingered. To this day, the image of a body on a stake evokes the same chilling terror that Assyrian kings once cultivated so carefully. Mutilation and dismemberment, justice carved into flesh. If flaying and impalement represented the Assyrians' most spectacular punishments, mutilation and dismemberment were their practical tools of control. Not every enemy needed to die. Sometimes it was more useful to let them live, but in a state so disfigured and broken that they became a walking warning to others. Mutilation served a dual purpose: punishment to inflict suffering proportional to the crime without the finality of death, deterrence to leave the victim alive as a living advertisement of Assyrian dominance. In this way, dismemberment was as much about humiliation as it was about pain. Assyrian kings often boasted of cutting off the ears, noses, or lips of rebels. These punishments permanently disfigured victims, branding them with visible signs of submission. An inscription of Ashurnasirpal II claims, "I cut off their noses, their ears, and extremities. I gouged out their eyes." The cruelty lay not only in the act, but in its aftermath. Imagine returning home without a nose or ears, forever marked as someone who defied the empire.
Such disfigurements carried enormous stigma in a society that valued physical wholeness. Blinding was another favored punishment. Captives, especially leaders of rebellions, might have their eyes gouged out before being paraded through the streets. The act not only destroyed their ability to lead, but also reduced once proud rulers to helpless beggars. Similarly, crippling, cutting tendons in the legs or arms, left enemies unable to fight again. Instead of killing soldiers outright, Assyrians sometimes maimed them, ensuring they lived as burdens on their families and communities. In some cases, the tongue was cut out to silence those who spoke against the king. This was punishment as both mutilation and metaphor. The rebel who once raised his voice now lived mute, unable to spread dissent. The power of this punishment was amplified by Assyrian propaganda. When rebels saw their leaders returned blind, tongueless, or crippled, they understood resistance was hopeless. Hands, feet, or fingers might be severed as punishment for theft or betrayal. Amputation carried a practical element, crippling criminals while sparing their lives, but also a symbolic one. The body itself became a record of guilt. Some reliefs depict prisoners with one hand or both feet missing, crawling at the mercy of Assyrian soldiers. Such imagery was not just documentation, but theatre, carved into stone to immortalize the empire's cruelty. For victims, mutilation was often worse than death. A disfigured man might be ostracized, unable to marry or work. In Mesopotamian belief, bodily wholeness was tied to dignity in the afterlife. To enter the underworld mutilated was to carry shame beyond death. Survivors became broken men, symbols of failure, whose existence reinforced the power of the state. Mutilation offered practical benefits. It required fewer resources than execution spectacles like impalement or flaying. It turned enemies into permanent warnings, and it allowed kings to demonstrate both mercy in sparing life and power in controlling how that life would be lived. This balance of cruelty and calculation was central to Assyrian punishment. Later empires also used mutilation. Medieval Europe cut off thieves' hands, Byzantium blinded political rivals, and Islamic courts sometimes prescribed amputations. But the Assyrians' scale and pride in dismemberment set them apart. They didn't just practice it quietly, they carved it into stone reliefs for all posterity. Long after the Assyrian Empire fell, stories of their mutilations haunted memory. They became archetypes of cruelty, cited by later writers as examples of tyranny at its worst. In truth, mutilation was not just savagery, it was a calculated system of governance. The Assyrians understood that sometimes the most effective punishment is not killing the body, but destroying the person who lived inside it.
Mass deportations and collective punishment, breaking peoples, not just men. If flaying and mutilation showcased Assyrian cruelty on a personal scale, mass deportations and collective punishment demonstrated it on a civilizational scale. The Assyrians understood that to control an empire as vast and diverse as theirs, it was not enough to break men. They had to break entire peoples. The Assyrians did not invent mass deportations, but they were the first to turn them into a systematic imperial policy, starting in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, 8th century BCE. Conquered populations were uprooted and scattered across the empire. Why? Because a rebellious people, bound together by shared homeland, language, and gods, could rise again. But a people torn from their soil, transplanted into foreign lands, forced to live among strangers, lost the cohesion that made rebellion possible. Assyrian kings boasted in their inscriptions about the staggering numbers they deported. Tiglath-Pileser III claimed to have relocated 65,000 Arameans. Sargon II reported moving 27,000 Samaritans after conquering Israel. Over centuries, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, were uprooted. Families were torn apart, ancestral lands abandoned, temples destroyed, and communities scattered across deserts, mountains, and foreign cities. The process was brutal and dehumanizing. Once a city was taken, its leaders were executed or mutilated, and its population enslaved. Then survivors were forced into long marches across Mesopotamia. Many perished from hunger, thirst, or exhaustion. Finally, the survivors were planted in new regions, often tasked with farming, building, or serving as laborers for the empire. The Assyrians documented these movements with chilling pride, treating them as trophies of conquest. But deportation was only one aspect of collective punishment. Entire cities could be destroyed, their walls leveled, their gods humiliated. Crops were burned, irrigation systems smashed, and livestock slaughtered. The message was clear: resistance dooms not just the rebel, but the entire community. This practice turned every man, woman, and child into guardians of obedience. If a single elder suggested rebellion, others would silence him for fear of losing their homes, their children, their very way of life. One of the most famous examples was the Assyrian conquest of the Kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. The capital, Samaria, fell to Sargon II. Tens of thousands of Israelites were deported, their cities resettled with foreign peoples. This policy effectively erased the identity of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Cut off from their homeland and scattered among foreign nations, they disappeared from history. For the Assyrians, this was the ultimate victory, not just the defeat of a kingdom, but the erasure of a people. Mass deportations were punishments that kept punishing. For decades, sometimes centuries, displaced peoples lived as strangers in strange lands, constantly reminded that they were exiles because of rebellion. Children grew up speaking new tongues, praying to foreign gods, and forgetting their ancestral traditions. In this way, deportation was not just a physical punishment, but a cultural execution. Yet there was also a practical, economic side. The Assyrians used deportations to repopulate areas devastated by war, to staff massive building projects, and to create a labor force loyal only to the king. In this way, punishment became productivity. A conquered people's suffering built Assyria's palaces, temples, and roads. Their grief fueled imperial glory. The Assyrian system of mass deportation influenced later empires, from the Babylonians, who deported the Jews to Babylon, to the Persians and even the Romans. The idea that entire peoples could be uprooted and scattered as a tool of control began with Assyria, but their legacy is remembered with bitterness. In Jewish, Babylonian, and Greek writings, the Assyrians are remembered not as bringers of civilization, but as destroyers of nations, their name synonymous with cruelty. Ritual executions and the theatre of death. To the Assyrians, punishment was never only about crime, it was about cosmic order. In their worldview, the king was the chosen representative of Asher, their chief deity, and rebellion against the king was rebellion against the gods themselves. That meant executions were not merely political punishments, they were rituals, staged performances meant to restore divine balance and broadcast Assyria's power to the heavens as much as to men. In Assyrian inscriptions, kings frequently described themselves as the arm of Asher, carrying out punishments not on their own authority, but on behalf of the divine. When a rebel was impaled or a traitor flayed, it was not just the king's wrath, it was divine justice. This framing gave executions enormous weight. They were no longer acts of cruelty, but sacred performances in which the victim was offered up as a warning to men and a sacrifice to gods. Executions were carefully staged. Captives were paraded through conquered cities, beaten, humiliated, and displayed before being killed. Crowds were forced to watch, transforming each execution into a communal ritual of obedience. The act of killing itself often carried symbolic meaning. Beheadings offered the head as proof of submission. Impalements raised the body skyward, as if displaying the condemned to the gods. Flayings turned flesh into an offering, nailed to walls like votive relics. Even the choice of location mattered. City gates, palace courts, and temples were the preferred stages, places where the maximum number of people and the gods themselves, could witness the punishment. The Assyrians reserved special treatment for captured enemy kings. To kill a king was to symbolically kill the god or spirit that protected his people. Some were paraded in chains before being executed, others forced to kneel beneath the Assyrian king before being ritually slain. A few were kept alive, mutilated, and displayed as trophies, living sacrifices who embodied the total defeat of their kingdoms. The message was clear: no throne, no god, no lineage could stand against Assyria. Fire was sacred in Mesopotamian religion, symbolizing divine wrath. Some victims, especially those accused of sacrilege or rebellion against Ashur, were executed by burning. To be consumed by fire was not just physical annihilation, but spiritual obliteration, the body destroyed so completely that no trace of dignity or afterlife remained. Such punishments reminded spectators that rebellion against Assyria was rebellion against the divine order itself, and that the gods demanded more than death. They demanded erasure. Priests sometimes oversaw or sanctified executions, ensuring the punishment was properly framed as divine justice. Prayers or proclamations might accompany the act, transforming the spectacle into a liturgy of terror. The condemned thus became a ritual offering, their suffering woven into the cosmic story of Assyria's right to rule. Why ritualize death? Because it magnified the impact. For the victim, to die as an enemy of the gods meant disgrace beyond death. For the spectators, they were not just watching justice, they were watching cosmic order being restored. For the king, each ritualized execution reinforced his role as divine agent, legitimizing his rule through blood. By tying execution to religion, the Assyrians ensured that fear of rebellion extended into the spiritual realm. It was not just a political crime, it was a cosmic sin. These executions were not forgotten once they ended. They were immortalized in reliefs and inscriptions, retold in oral traditions, and carried by travelers to distant lands. The Assyrians wanted their cruelty remembered, not hidden. Each ritual killing was both a sacred offering and a political broadcast, ensuring that Assyria's power resonated across the empire. Later, empires borrowed the idea of ritualized punishment from the Persians, who executed traitors as offerings to Ahura Mazda, to Rome, where crucifixion served as a ritual humiliation under divine and imperial authority. But the Assyrians were among the first to so openly fuse religion, politics, and punishment into one terrifying spectacle. Their theater of death was not entertainment, but education. It taught subjects to fear rebellion, respect the king, and accept the god's order as embodied in the Assyrian state.